Well, hi everyone, and we'll wait a few seconds as people filter in and connect to our Zoom town hall. It's great to see all the faces flooding over the screen, and welcome to this event. So we'll just give people a few moments to come in. Great to see all of you joining us from around the nation. We have people from the length and breadth of the country joining us, and they're all just clicking on now. Great to see the screens filling up. And thank you for joining us this evening. Okay, so we'll start. So thank you for being with us here today, or this evening really, as we launch the Thrive by 5 campaign. Before we start, just a few housekeeping matters. We're recording this session to be uploaded online later, and we're live streaming it via our partners on Facebook. So please be respectful, obviously. Don't say anything that you wouldn't say in a public forum, because it is a public forum. We encourage you to keep your video on. It really does add to the sense of this being really a community event where everybody's here together, and that's what this format does. It makes us feel like we're all basically in one event. If you're on a computer or a laptop, you can set your screen to gallery view by clicking the button on the top right hand corner. There's also a chat function, so please use it to ask questions or to make a comment. Feel free to jump into the chat and introduce yourself. And you can use this also to ask questions for the speakers, which our backstage team will filter and pass on for Q&A a bit later on. So everyone has had their microphone off by default, and an admin will turn it back on if you're called on during the Q&A. So I'll ask you to ask your question and then you'll be switched on for that purpose. So when you do that, we encourage people to use their full names. And if you are representing an organisation, it would be great if you could include that name as well. If you're having any technical issues, please private message any of the tech support people in the chat, and you'll be able to find them as they've renamed themselves as tech support. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm honoured to be situated on the ancestral lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. We acknowledge the first Australians as the traditional owners of the lands we represent, and we pay respect to their elders, both past and present. And we know that we gather from across the nation on many lands, and we acknowledge the important relationships that exist across the length and breadth of this country. So when I began this journey, for me, it really happened back in South Australia. I was given ministerial responsibility in 2004 for family portfolios concerning children. And then 2 months later, I had my first child, my daughter. And during that period, not only was I juggling a little child, but I was also learning about this extraordinary story of the way in which children's brains develop during the first 5 years. And I think it's impossible to hear that story without it changing your life and changing really the way in which you see public policy, because so much flows from those first 5 years of life. And for me, I tried to do what I could when I was in public office, but I always had a sense that so much more needed to be done in this area. And when I left public life, I ended up volunteering in a range of organisations to do with early childhood development. And then I had the great thrill of being offered this role as CEO of Thrive by 5 by Nicola and Andrew Forrest, to really head up this initiative, which is about making sure that each child gets the very best start that they can in life. And we know that the evidence has been there for a very long time. For the last 30 years, I think we've understood the critical importance of the way in which experiences interact with the child's brain development and how profound that is for their lifelong learning, behaviour and health trajectories. But there is a massive gap between what we know and what we do. And that's what this campaign is all about. The campaign we're launching this evening is to really put early childhood development on the national political agenda and the agenda of every state and territory government in this country. You would have seen today that Nicola Forrest and Fiona Stanley have jointly signed an open letter to the federal government calling on them to reform our early learning system in this country. And we'll be talking about what that means a bit later on. But really what this is about is not a campaign by any one organisation. It's meant to inspire a social movement for change. So this campaign will be as strong as all of the people that join it. And in a real sense, it's your campaign. The people that have joined this meeting, the people that will join it after this meeting. And what we really hope by the end of this process, that you'll be inspired to take the next step, to join the Thrive by 5 campaign, to go to thriveby5.org.au, to add your name and your signatory to the letter that have been signed by many eminent Australians, published in the daily papers today, so that we can truly build a social movement for change on this critically important issue. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce some of our great speakers today. With us today we have Minderoo Foundation co-founder and co-chair, Dr. Nicola Forrest, AO. Nicola is co-founder and co-chair of the Minderoo Foundation, one of Australia's largest philanthropic organisations. Nicola is passionate about early childhood development, education and the arts, and she guides the Foundation's work in these areas. In 2019, Nicola was awarded an Officer of the Order of Australia for her distinguished services to the community through philanthropic support for the education, arts, business and the community. Nicola holds 3 federal advisory board positions. Most notably, she's Chief Convener of the Prime Minister's Community Business Partnerships. She's Chair of Black Swan State Theatre Company, a board member for the Early Years Initiative, and in 2018 was inducted into Western Australia's Women's Hall of Fame. So Nicola, it's been almost 2 decades since you established the Australian Children's Trust. Can you tell us why early childhood is so important to you?
Thank you, Jay, and hello everybody. Andrew and I established the Australian Children's Trust, which was the precursor for the Minderoo Foundation, primarily because we wanted to see better outcomes for children. And we believe that investing in children was the best way to help a society improve. And, you know, in fact, we started a journey where we invested in Generation 1 was one of the first areas that we invested, because we thought by giving parents a job, you help children thrive. And we've gone down that pipeline where we've tried to keep kids in school, tried to have other programs. And in the end, when you look at the science around the development of a child's brain and the first few years of a child's life, you can't look at children in any other way than if we don't invest there to give them the best outcomes in their life. Everything else we do is patching up rather than preventing. So that's what drove us. And at Minderoo, we believe Thrive by 5, all children should and can have the opportunity to thrive by the time they're 5, no matter where they live or what their postcode is.
Thanks, Nicola. And I know that one of the early projects you invested in was the Chalice School up there in the northern suburbs of Perth. And you've also worked closely with Telethon Kids Institute, published evidence papers, and obviously created the Bright Tomorrows app, which is gives parenting tips for the early years. I suppose all of that has been going on, but why have you decided that it's important now to back this public campaign?
So Jay, we have always tried to translate the evidence into vehicles that people could digest, particularly parents and caregivers, so that everybody wants to do the best for their child. So if you're given the evidence, of course, you're going to try and do the best. But, you know, sitting here alongside Fiona Stanley, who in 2003 spoke about all of this, and we all know the evidence. You know, when you speak to politicians, they know the evidence. So why haven't we done something about it? So today we come together with this campaign, aligned with so many people on this screen. Thank you all for being here. We all are impatient and want to see this change, and the time has come. I think COVID has also preempted what we, you joined us, and then I think you joined from Adelaide, and a week later you were stuck here. Thank God for that. It has given us another opportunity and a platform to really drive this home, to show where the frailties and the cracks are in the current lack of system.
Yeah, and thanks. So what would you say that system looks like? What is the vision for you of early childhood development in this country?
So I think there's a triple dividend in what we're trying to promote in this campaign. And the first and most important thing is that there's an easily accessible, affordable early childhood development system. So it's got to be, we've got to fill the gap between the maternal health and the school system, and everything in between. It's just a mess. And so that's what this campaign is about. And the triple dividend from that will be that we will have children being nurtured in a proper way. We'll have women being able to go back and into the workforce more easily. And finally, we're going to have, it's a productivity issue. We're going to have the health and well-being of children being able to feed into the productivity of this nation in the future.
Wonderful, Nicola. That's a fantastic vision. Could I now just take you to our next speaker, Professor Fiona Stanley, AO, Professor at the School of Paediatrics and Child Health at the University of Western Australia, UNICEF Australian Ambassador for Early Childhood Development, and obviously incredibly well known for her public health work in epidemiology. Fantastic to have you with us today, Fiona. It's a real privilege. Can I ask you about your appearance in the National Press Club back in 2003 now, I think, calling for reform in this area? And I know you had some success. You managed to persuade the then Prime Minister, John Howard, to establish the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Young People, ARACI. Are we any closer to the reform that we need, though?
Jay, that's a really anguishing question, but thank you again for inviting me onto this incredibly important panel and to be part of this campaign. I just want to start by saying that I'm on Noongar Boodja and acknowledge the elders and the spiritual nature of Aboriginal culture. And also I just want to say that one of the people who was incredibly instrumental in helping us set up ARACI and has done so much for children and young people in Australia, Margot Pryor, died last week of COVID in Melbourne. And I just want to acknowledge her. There'll be a lot of people on the Zoom, I think, who will remember Margot and her contribution. And she was, I met her because we were setting up ARACI together. So it's very relevant to what you've asked. When we convinced Howard and his cabinet about the importance of early childhood, the Bible at that stage, and this is actually, it was towards the end of the 90s, but it culminated in the National Press Club talk. There was a book that was written by Dan Keating and Clyde Hertzman called Developmental Health and the Wealth of Nations. And in it, it gave the arguments, which we gave to John Howard and his team, about how brain development in children in the early years was absolutely vital to their life's capacity to participate in society and to be employed and to face the challenges of a modern world that was going to be a knowledge economy. The other thing that was incredibly powerful was the brain imaging and the information that you saw from these changes in brain images over time in children, and particularly the images of brains of children who had been deprived in Romanian orphanages, for example. They were very powerful images. And the major changes that have happened since those early 2000s when we set up ARACI and we've got the longitudinal study of Australian children going, is that there's been a range of child and youth problems which we predicted would have occurred and increased, and they have. So I can't be pleased to say I told you so, because it's so anguishing. But if we had developed the system that we were suggesting, then we wouldn't have this range of problems in health, in developmental disorders, in school and learning disabilities, People have just looked at the latest PISA results from Australia, and we're just going down and down compared with other countries. The mental health problems in kids, and of course the thing that's so expensive at the end of pathways, and all these are, is the justice system. The costs now for these are anticipated, we put it in the letter, about $15 billion a year. And that's been because of the increasing risk factors and the decrease in the protective factors, which is part of the protective factors were, of course, high quality, accessible childcare. And I think that, you know, that's the thing that I guess has been anguishing, that's changed since those late 90s, early 2000s. The other thing that I just want to mention is the complete cessation of funding, federal funding, for the Aboriginal controlled early childhood centres around the country, about 70 of them. And they were remarkable centres of culture and learning and domestic violence support, all of these things, employment for women, as well as childcare and language. You know, June Oscar had one in Kimberley, there was a Bibbert woman in metropolitan Melbourne. And the cessation of funding for those was disastrous. And I think that that meant that a lot of the problems that Aboriginal kids are facing over the next decade will result from that not being funded. And I think the other thing that's happened, which Nicola's already referred to, is this state and federal divide, the chaotic privatised system of poor quality childcare. Of course, it's not all poor quality, but COVID has really exposed the frailties of both the childcare system and the aged care system. And I think it's been a very good exposure because we can see that these things might be expensive. They are the childcare, the private childcare is not reaching those most in need. And I think, you know, it's very important that we learn from this COVID time to actually do things better. And so we've known about the importance of early childhood for such a long time, for 4 decades or more. The principles are clear. OECD supports it, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, you know, the wonderful economists who received Nobel Prize for their proposals for this. So I think it is the most important investment that we can make to enable the majority of young people, as Nicola said, to achieve their potential. But it's also this amazing amount of the budget that is spent at the end of pathways that is just such a waste and so ineffective. And so to me, this is now an urgent and anguishing problem. I can't believe that it's 2020 and we're still going along this path. And of course, the other thing that's very exciting is the way that the Grattan Institute and other economic analyses are coming out to say, wow, you don't have to wait 7 years to get the economic benefits in investing in early childhood. They'll be immediate because of the employment of women. And that's particularly relevant after the COVID pandemic.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you for those insights, and also thank you for a career of bringing this to our attention. I think much of what we're building today in this campaign is really off the back of work that you've started. So thank you so much, and thank you for that.
Lots of people worked with me, Jay. It was a huge national agenda, and it was a marvellous thing. And we'll get it back again because many of these people are still as anguished and as passionate as I am.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, I know that there are a number of people that might be hearing things and thinking of questions. Don't hesitate to join the chat. Put any questions in or even remarks and we'll capture them all. They're all going to be valuable for us. Can I now take the opportunity to introduce our next speaker? We have a very broad set of contributors from across the political spectrum, different professions, different elements of the Australian community. And it's wonderful for us to have today the former Liberal Deputy Party leader, Julie Bishop, who's currently Chancellor of the Australian National University and, of course, Chair of Telethon Kids, 2 organisations with deep and important links to the early childhood development agenda. So welcome, Julie. And Julie, could I first ask you, why do you think that childcare and early education seems to be a relatively low priority on the federal government's agenda?
Well, thanks, Jay, and perhaps I can answer that fairly loaded question in a number of ways. In fact, I'll make 3 points wearing a different hat in relation to each point. First, as a former Federal Education Minister, I know that early childhood development is an area of high priority for all federal governments because they do understand the consequences. But there's always this question about responsibility for early childhood development more broadly. Now, the federal government provides the majority of funding for childcare services, as you know, mostly through fee subsidies. And last financial year, I think they budgeted about $8.6 billion, but that's obviously going to be much higher due to that period of free childhood services during COVID. But then state and territory governments have the primary responsibility for funding early childhood education, although the federal government does provide support through the national partnerships, and they've done that since about 2009. And that additional funding was to support universal access for all children to 15 hours a week in the year before school. And as I understand it, most states have exceeded that. Well, I think they've exceeded that, 95% benchmark. But this just begs the question, should there just be one level of government that's dealing with early childhood, that is early childhood education, development and childcare services? So let me put this on the table. How about the National Cabinet that has been dealing with COVID-related issues and has brought together the state and territory premiers and leaders with the Prime Minister? How about we put this whole issue fairly on the National Cabinet's agenda, because we've seen how public policy can be very flexible and adaptable in the face of a global pandemic. Well, this is a significant issue, and I would like to see it on that National Cabinet agenda. My second point, and let me put on my Chair of Telethon Kids Institute hat, a leading paediatric research institute for children, of course, founded originally by the wonderful Fiona Stanley. I believe that this is a really important campaign, as it does challenge how we as a nation recognise the importance of early childhood as a powerful driver of good social and economic outcomes. And we do know, as Fiona pointed out, we do know that high quality early learning environments can have a really positive impact on a child's development, especially children from what would be considered disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, universal access brings about greater equity and opportunity and is an investment in children. It's an investment in our nation's future. And I think it should be seen as an investment rather than a cost. And then finally, as Chancellor of the Australian National University, we have many researchers focused on how critical early childhood can be for a person's development, as do all of our universities. But I think it's worth noting, and I certainly took account of this when I took on the role earlier this year, that one of our most important studies is in the ANU College of Business and Economics. It's not in public health or medicine, it's in business and economics, to examine the effectiveness of intervention in early childhood. And it's being led by Professor John List. He's an American economist who, when he was with the University of Chicago, launched what was then the most comprehensive longitudinal early childhood study ever conducted. It was wildly successful. The findings were that early childhood education has massive returns for the investment. And if you can foster development during the early years and place a child on a successful path in life, then the returns are enormous. So it shows that it's a question of economics, and that should appeal to governments, federal, state and territory. So I hope that those contributions, wearing my 3 different hats, can generate some discussion tonight.
Oh, thank you, Julie. And that's an intriguing observation about the National Cabinet, because having laboured through some pretty sclerotic sort of COAG meetings, perhaps this being the destination for that issue might allow us an opportunity for change. So thank you for that contribution. I might, and look, take up Julie's invitation to remark on those propositions and in the chat, and also any questions you might have to her or any of the other speakers who have spoken or are coming up. We also have with us this evening Michelle O'Neill. Michelle is the current president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions and has over 25 years of campaigning experience addressing insecure work and women's inequality. So Michelle, thanks for joining us. And if you could tell us, I know that the ACT have just launched a jobs and recovery plan. You are calling, amongst other things, for high quality, universally accessible childcare as one of the 5 key areas. Why did you land on that particular plank, and why has it been so prominent?
Thanks, Jay, and hi everyone. Great to see you all. And I want to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation tonight and pay all my respects to the elders past and present, and it always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. And that means I'm in Melbourne, so yes, I'm mid-serious lockdown here. The ACT, of course, has been involved across the whole union movement with business and with government dealing with the public health crisis of this pandemic. But what we all realised very quickly was the impact it was having on our economy, and in particular for us on jobs. And so, as well as dealing with getting through the public health crisis, we quickly started looking at what was needed to try and support people staying in work and also creating jobs of the future. And it wasn't a big leap, Jay, to start to look at what was happening in terms of women's work, because we saw that one of the things that the pandemic exposed was that women, particularly at the beginning, were the ones who were losing jobs and losing hours quicker than men. And then when you looked at where women worked, there was a whole very gendered impact of what was going on across our labour market and economy. And we thought there needed to be a massive approach to this that was about a national economic reconstruction plan. This is an unprecedented crisis. And when we looked at that, we thought it was really important that public money be spent for public good and that we had lasting legacy out of what was being put into stimulus. So, of course, early childhood education and care is really one of the most obvious things that when you invest in that, you invest in not just the short-term impact, but of course you're investing in our future. So it is one of the 5 key things that we've called for in the plan. And it is important not just because of recognising what's happened in terms of women as a result of the pandemic, but also because when you think about what's needed to look at the labour market of the future and what happens for jobs of the future, we need to make sure that we repair economic employment prospects for women workers. And so we've called for a strategy of high quality, public funded, not-for-profit childcare and early learning services. And we know when we look at economic studies that government investment in early childhood education and care literally pays for itself. Once you take into account the additional output and taxes that come about from women's increased labour force participation. So women's labour force participation in Australia is actually far below rates in comparable industrial countries. If Australian women that are aged between 25 and 45 participated in the labour market the same as men do in Australia, then the economy would benefit with an extra 475,000 potential new workers, an enormous boost in terms of economic growth, government revenue, and also family incomes. If those women were working, the GDP of Australia would actually be $70 billion higher, and family incomes would be boosted by $30 billion a year. So we also know, and some of you have mentioned this, of course, that early childhood education provides a significant benefit to our children. We've got the educational benefits of it, helping to improve their employment, income, and health, as they grow older and go through life. And those first 5 years is when our brains develop fastest, and of course it develop more and faster than any other time in our life. And universal access to early childhood education and care is essential to be able to ensure that women can participate fully in the workforce, but also to actually do better for the future of our children and the lives of future generations of children. And the last key element of why we thought this was so critical, Jay, was that the women who make up 97% of the workers in this sector. So when you look at the workers in early childhood education and care, when I look at those workers, I think they do some of the hardest jobs you can ever do. And the work is so undervalued. 97% women. We entrust these workers with our babies and our children and with their education and care, but at the same time we undervalue their work, we underpay them, and we don't provide them with secure, reliable jobs. So central to improving early childhood education and care is bringing about a fundamental reassessment of the importance of this work, lifting the recognition and the pay of the workers in the sector, and ensuring we actually create long-term careers for people doing work that is so critical to not just our children of today, but of course our future. So they're the reasons why we put early childhood education and care, and the fact that there should be permanently free childcare for all Australian families as one of the key demands of our National Economic Reconstruction Plan, Jay. And we are very happy to be part of this campaign and this event, and I just want to congratulate all of you for making it happen.
Thank you, Michelle. And it's a great reminder, actually, about what sits at the heart of this. It's about valuing children. It's about a society that values children and values those who educate them, and supports parents and caregivers in their relationship as they carry out the most important role in society. So thank you for that wonderful reminder. Well, we're moving now to a different part of the night where we'll be talking to some people who are directly experiencing the consequences of the current system. So I'll now throw to a parent, a mum, Rebecca Browder, who's a Perth-based solicitor, mum of 2, and she has some experiences that she wants to share with us about using the childcare system in its current form. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you.
And the first thing is, why do you think the system needs to change for you and also for other parents?
At the moment, it's really confusing and it's frustrating to try and navigate just from the start of figuring out what your entitlements are, whether you're even entitled to subsidised care. And then once you're actually in the system, the costs are crippling. I currently work part-time, and if I was to work full-time under the current system, the extra day would cost me more than I would benefit. And even working part-time at 3 days a week, I'm out of pocket about 50 to 60%. So we need reform. It needs to change because it's keeping women out of work. It's prohibiting women from working full-time. It's prohibiting women from getting back into the workforce. I know so many women who are educated, talented professionals who aren't able to return to work or have chosen to work part-time because of the cost of care.
So, Rebecca, what does that mean for maybe at your level or other people that have spoken to you, the question of your career progression and your lifelong opportunities? Have you seen any effect of the current system on that?
Yes, certainly. Because, so for myself in particular, I have had to reduce my days because of the cost of care, which means I'm not available to do as much work as I previously was. I'm not around to take on as much work. And because I can't take on the bigger work, I can't take on bigger matters, I'm not as competitive as my colleagues who can work full-time and who are able to do it and put their hands up and say, I'll do it, I can work tomorrow. And that potentially does restrict my career progression. It means that I'm in this holding pattern until my children are in school.
And I know you have educators in your family and that work in this sector.
Yeah.
Your experience, and I no doubt you discuss it with them, what have they shared with you?
So I have two sisters. My younger sister is a lead educator, and she is one of the hardest working people I know. The care and the passion that she puts in is incredible. She loves those kids, and she spends so much time outside of hours working, thinking of experiences for the kids, looking at new equipment that she can put in the room. But she's one of the most poorly paid workers in Australia. She is paid probably less than half of what a primary school teacher in the same role, in the same qualification, same level would be paid. And my middle sister, she was in the early learning years framework teaching, and she had two kids in care at the same time, in the same centre that she was working at. But the cost of having the kids in care outweighed what she earned. So she has left the sector, and that is a shame because she was a very, very talented educator.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those stories, Rebecca. And just reminding any of you that to join the chat, but also to join our campaign. So those of you that have joined the call since the start, you can join the campaign for change by signing up to our website, thriveby5.org.au, or throw the link around so that you can get other people to encourage to join. Next, we'll have a representative from another group who has also been deeply affected by the failures of our current early learning system. Sam Elphick is a room educator at a centre at Wagga Wagga and has worked in the sector for over 15 years. She holds a diploma and is studying her degree as an early childhood teacher. Sam, can I first welcome, and can I ask you, how is the current system really affecting you, and what faults do you see with it?
Thank you, Jay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. I appreciate being part of this. I think it's a great experience. Children deserve high-quality care in a positive and nurturing setting with professionally paid educators. Early childhood educators are underpaid, overworked, exhausted, strained and challenged by an industry that does not value their presence and hard work. Educators currently take work home, they do unpaid overtime, they come to work frustrated by the current situation on a daily basis and still provide high quality care. Educators provide resources off their own back to support children's education. The system is broken. And now COVID has hit our centres, and that is the straw that broke the camel's back. It has placed an immense amount of pressure on top of our already overflowing workload, not to mention wages, which barely keep us afloat. Early childhood educators are burnt out. They have limits to time off, and sick days are happening everywhere we look. We are struggling to support a system that undervalues and underpays professional educators as we provide the best start in life for children under the age of 5 across the country. Staff turnover is increasing by the minute. We simply lose educators because their current wages aren't worth the stress and anguish they are experiencing. COVID-19 has created a mountain of issues and placed extra pressure on an already inadequate system. We can't do this job on love alone. We need the system to support us.
Thanks, Sam. And do you have anything you could share with us about what you'd like to see change, the most urgent and first thing that would change?
Well, every day we see children missing out on high quality care education because simply the funding isn't there. Centres across the country are experiencing budget constraints affecting all areas of development. Food budgets, which struggle to cover a third of the groceries required to prepare nutritionally balanced meals for children. And the COVID has added extra pressure on top of our already strained budgets. Ordering the basic hygiene essentials has become a juggling act. The price of a box of gloves has just risen from $2 to $12. So if you do the maths on that, every box we would purchase could have been 6 boxes.
Yeah, well, that sounds like it's putting massive pressure on you and the people with whom you work. But one thing I do want to say, Samantha, is thank you for your work, and we really value what you do for these children, and we're thrilled that you're joining this campaign. Now I want to, it's a pleasure. Now I want to really have a discussion with some of the remaining speakers who want to share some perspectives on their view of this campaign. The Thrive by 5 campaign is, of course, advocating for high quality, universally accessible early learning. Australia's childcare system needs reform to turn it into a proper system of early learning, obviously to help women develop their careers and strengthen the Australian economy as we recover from the pandemic, but most fundamentally of all, allow the healthy and successful development of our children. So this morning we wrote an open letter to the federal government, as you've seen published in 3 of the major dailies, outlining everything that's been discussed today and also telling the federal government what we want. So the Commonwealth, we believe, needs to repair the system of early learning. The states need to step up and take responsibility and connect this to their systems as well. We believe that a fully integrated system of the type that was discussed by Julie Bishop earlier is the vision for the future. That there has to be the level of government that has responsibility for all the other critical elements of primary care needs to sit around this system of early learning. By reforming this system in the way in which we contemplate, it will have a profound effect also on families and the pressures that they face. We know that families under pressure are also not places that are good for children. If we can take pressure off families, in particular this very large burden that comes from the cost of childcare, we can make a massive and important contribution to the wellbeing of children. The way in which this campaign is being constructed is about many voices, but one message. And the approach is designed to bring campaign partners together to create this systemic change for which we're advocating. And so we're so pleased at the length and breadth of the people that we've been able to bring together. But the movement is only as strong as everybody that comes and joins it. And so we're thrilled that Helen Gibbons, the Director of Early Childhood Education and Care at United Workers Union, has pledged as one of the campaign partners and is helping to push reform. Helen obviously represents the workers in this sector, the educators. Helen, can you tell us a little about the experience of early educators like Sam and others, and perhaps tell us about how they've been affected by the failures of the current system?
Thanks, Jay. I think this is really exciting to be involved in a campaign that is calling for real structural reform in a sector that I and all of our members are incredibly passionate about. We all understand the cost of early education on families, and it is an incredibly significant part of the family budget, but it also comes with a really enormous cost for early educators. The system as it stands currently is being subsidised through the low wages of early educators, and Sam spoke about that, and so did Michelle. It's a system that is costing early educators every day of the week that they work, and not only their working life, but also well into retirement. And it's not just unfair, although it really obviously is unfair. It's also just unsustainable. 37% of early educators intend to leave the sector. And that turnover figure rises to 45% in regional and remote areas. It's well over double the national average. And these statistics were before the enormous stresses and strains that we've heard about in the pandemic that Sam spoke about, that are no doubt going to increase the exodus of early educators leaving. And the driving force for this is really obvious. It's about low wages, and it wastes money. It wastes all the skills and all the experience that these early educators have. That training and experience walks out the door when they leave. It burns through their commitment. It burns through their experience, but possibly more importantly, it has a devastating impact on children and families. close ongoing relationships between a child and an educator are just crucial. They're crucial to high quality early education. And consistent, trusting relationships with educators are crucial to parents. They want to know and trust the educators that they're handing their children over to every morning. And it's just heartbreaking when their trusted educator leaves because they just can't afford to stay any longer. And we all want to build a world-class system, and I'm really excited to be involved in this campaign to do so. But we've got to address the turnover issue and how we value early educators, the very people that deliver on that system. They're brilliant, they're passionate, they're committed, and we need them, and we need to make sure that they stay in the sector.
Thank you, Helen. That's a wonderful reminder. I can remember the angst-ridden moments handing over a child to a particular early childhood educator, and if she wasn't there, I can't imagine what would have happened. So that continuity is just so critical to the lives of families.
Absolutely.
Can I now ask Georgie Dent, who's CEO of the Parenthood, about her experiences? I know that her organisation, obviously dedicated to hearing the voice of parents, has been gathering their views, and Georgie is a journalist, editor and author, and a passionate advocate on their behalf. She's also a former lawyer and a regular media commentator and public speaker. So, Georgie, you've heard what Rebecca said earlier, but what are you hearing overall? What are parents saying about this system?
Well, parents are saying, and thank you, Jay, very much for having me involved in this campaign. It's a real honour, and I would like to acknowledge the Camaragal people. That's the land on which I'm coming from. We are hearing really consistently from parents, exactly as Rebecca articulated, that the cost of childcare is, early childhood education and care is so expensive that it does impact the decisions that families make about who works and when they work. We know that the subsidy system in combination with our tax system is particularly punitive for secondary earners, and I live for the day where we don't have to talk about primary and secondary earners, but the reality in Australia, and this is partly because the cost of care is so high, is that we do know women work less, they earn less money and they work less. And therefore it is their work that is overall impacted when the family is making decisions about who works and how that is managed. So we know that even before the pandemic, the cost of childcare was so high that it did form a barrier for women participating in the workforce. At the Parenthood, when we surveyed 2,200 families at the end of May, 40% reported that they had either one parent or two parents had lost income, and 66% of those families overall had said that before the pandemic they had considered that the cost of early childhood education and care was so high that they did reconsider who worked and when they worked. And then that just creates a situation where you have children who miss out on all of the wonderful, indisputable benefits that they have when they do have that continuity and access to high quality education. But it also means that you have got a gender that is really unable to establish the financial footing that means they can have financial security at the end of their life rather than financial poverty, which they have accumulated because they have taken on the responsibility for caring, which is a role that is unpaid.
Yeah. Thank you, Georgie. And one of the things I do want to say to people is I know they're sending through lots of messages on the chat. Some of them are questions, and we'll seek to pose those a little bit later. But when you've got comments, etc., we'll actually gather them up and respond to them. That they'll be of great assistance to us. So they will be responded to, perhaps not necessarily tonight, but we'll take them away and respond to them and enter a dialogue with you. So thank you for your thoughts. We really value them. And thank you very much, Georgie, for that contribution and the wonderful work you're doing leading this public debate. Can I now turn my attention to Myra Geddes, General Manager Social Impact at Good Start Early Learning. Myra started out her life as a teacher and heads up the social inclusion program within Good Start Early Learning. And so I can talk about the benefits to children from the universal access, but also the importance of high quality early learning. So Myra, Good Start is Australia's largest not-for-profit provider. So from a provider's perspective, how does the current system, you believe, work either for or against children, and what can be done to change it?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Jagera and Turrbal people here and pay my respects to elders past, present, and the emerging leaders that are across in early learning centres right across the country. And I think as early childhood professionals, I wanted to say at the outset that, and you can see from the chat, that we're all very excited by the prospect of this campaign, and we really commend the Minderoo Foundation for investing in children, because that's what this is all about. And I think the momentum that we're going to gather from this today has the potential to be really powerful. Good Start is the largest provider, and we operate in every state and territory. So we are in a good position to sort of look right across the national landscape and think about what's working best, and where do we need to improve for children. And we've already touched tonight, I think, on some of the key strengths of the current system, which is our dedicated educators, teachers, and centre leaders. And they've been improving the quality of teaching and learning right across the country, particularly over the last decade. And more recently, through COVID, through bushfires, by supporting the children and families of essential workers and children at risk, have really highlighted to families, to communities, to politicians, and families just how essential they are themselves. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind when we think about what do we want the system to look like for the future. We also know that this week, thousands of children right across the country have accessed fabulous high quality early learning programs delivered by dedicated teachers. But the current system certainly doesn't give the best start in life to every child. And in fact, the way that it's designed means that the children who stand to benefit the most are the least likely to attend. And when they do attend, we know from evidence that they're more likely to access a poor quality service than other children. Right now, we know that too many children can't access enough days of high quality early learning to make a difference because of what their parents are doing and how much they're working, because the amount of access they have depends on how much their parents are working. I know from experience at Good Start and as a teacher that too many educators and teachers get frustrated that they can't provide the additional support that some children need to thrive, because that additional support isn't available to all of the children that need it. And too many families, as Georgie mentioned, can't send their children as often as they'd like because it's simply not affordable and the subsidies are too low. And in fact, at Good Start, when early learning was provided at no out-of-pocket cost to families, thousands of low-income families said to us the thing they valued the most about that was being able to send their children, their children extra days to high-quality early learning that normally they couldn't afford. So there's absolutely a real need for reform to make sure that every child, no matter where they live, no matter what their mum or their dad or their guardian does, can access enough high quality early learning to make a difference. And I mean, could you imagine a world where the numbers of days that a child got to go to school was set based on how many days their parents worked? Or if children could only access healthcare or an emergency department if their parents were in approved work, study or training? And you know, the answer is of course not. We invest in those things because they're good for all children. They're good for our whole society, for our whole economy, as many other people have referenced here today, both in the short and long term. And so I think moving forward, by building on the great foundation we have in our sector, the dedicated educators, teachers and centre leaders, there's no reason why together through this campaign we can't achieve a high quality early learning system that gives all children the best possible start in life.
Thank you, Mara. That was beautifully put. So thanks for that contribution. Obviously, one of the things that we're grappling with at the moment is the post-pandemic world. And our attention is turning to rebuilding an economy which is obviously in deep trouble. One of our speakers today is Kate Carnell. She's the first Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, and of course in that role advocates for small business owners. Kate is a former Liberal Party Chief Minister of the ACT and was last year named as one of AFR's 100 Women of Influence in the public policy category. So thanks for joining us, Kate. And there's been a lot of research saying that high quality, universally accessible childcare is an economic benefit and obviously particularly help to get women into the workforce. But are there other benefits, and what are your thoughts on this analysis?
Look, thanks, Jay, and thanks so much for having me here, because I'm going to approach this a little differently. There are 2.3 million operating small businesses in this country. Every day we hear politicians, governments at all levels talking about the small business sector as being the engine room of the economy. In 2018, a recent NAB report showed that 76% of all new jobs came from the small business sector. So we need the small business sector to be firing to get our economy back on track post-COVID. But, or positively, 40% of small businesses are owned by women, and that particular figure is going up quite quickly. The problem is that for many small businesses, they struggle to grow their business. So a large number of those small businesses owned by women are in the micro space, the under 5 employee space. Reason for that is they struggle to be able to afford childcare and grow their business. So they're trying to juggle childcare, growing their business, and so they keep their businesses small. We desperately need those women to grow their businesses because they're incredibly capable entrepreneurs, but they can only do that, remember, at a time when they're investing in their business, if they can afford full-time childcare so they can spend full-time growing their business and employing Australians. So this is an economic argument as well on how we keep and make the most out of the very large number of women who are competent entrepreneurs, who have great degrees, great training from universities, but are being stifled in their entrepreneurial capacity, their business growth, by the fact they simply can't afford childcare at the same time as employing and growing their businesses. And it's important also to remember that in the COVID scenario, a large number of the businesses that women are running are in hospitality, the arts, events, the areas that have been hit worst. So if we expect, and we really want, these businesses to get up and running quickly, these women and business owners are having to put huge amounts of blood, sweat and tears into those businesses to keep them afloat, to get them up and running again. The free childcare that was available for a short period of time was a godsend for many of them, absolute godsend. Because now when they're paying childcare again, when their businesses are under stress, they're in all sorts of trouble. So they're having to pull back on the hours they can put into their business. This is simply not rational economics, let alone being, as many people have said here today, really important for childhood growth and getting the most out of young people. Let's look at it as an economic issue, and one that you can start getting benefits immediately by letting those women, encouraging those women to get back in the workforce. And remember, I said 2.3 million businesses. If just half of those businesses employed one extra person, there goes unemployment.
Thank you, Kate. And that perspective, I think, is quite a novel one for the debate, is the small business perspective. I don't think that's really been offered before in this debate in earlier iterations of it. So thank you very much for that perspective.
A pleasure.
We also, continuing, I suppose, on that conversation, we also have with us today Adrian Piccoli. Adrian served as a member of the New South Wales Parliament for 19 years and as the New South Wales Minister for Education for 6, when we were colleagues together. Adrian has championed a greater focus on the learning needs of disadvantaged children, particularly those living in rural and remote Australia. He's currently Director of UNSW's Gonski Institute for Education. And welcome, Adrian. And how will reform of the early learning system address disadvantage in the broader education system from your perspective?
Well, thanks very much, Jay, and thanks to the Minderoo Foundation for putting this together and driving this initiative. Look, I mean, as many people have said, the evidence around the value of investing in early childhood, there is really no dispute about that. I mean, where we find the problem is really at a political level. So I just wanted to make a pragmatic contribution to this. You know, you're probably not on this. You're probably not in this meeting if you don't agree with the sentiment of the campaign that you're driving, Jay. But you know, as Julie Bishop said right at the beginning, a couple of other people have said, you know, it's really complex, and when really complex things come to government, it is a great excuse not to do anything, to kick the can down the road. Because if you can't be sure that what you're going to do has at least the majority of stakeholders on side, you're going to look for easier pathways. And I think until some of that complexity has been sorted out, this will continue to be kicked down the road by well-meaning governments who, as has been said, absolutely understand the value of early childhood, but it is complex. When I used to meet with early childhood stakeholders, I used to have to get 20 people in the boardroom at the department because there were just so many different sectors to it. So complexity is a big political barrier to actually achieving the kind of reform we've been talking about tonight. You know, amongst the states, Jay, you and I have sat there in ministerial council meetings. Between the states and territories, we can't even agree on the name of it. The years that children should start school. We couldn't even agree on the 12 or 15 hours, right? I mean, these are the complexities that have to be overcome. Otherwise, governments can continue to kick it down the road. So I think you need three things. One is a clear reform path. So none of this tinkering around, you know, changing the way we subsidise parents and subsidise fees. You know, we need to clear up this difference between, well, in New South Wales at least, we call it preschool and long day care. I know this, you know, the name problems. You know, is it preschool? Is it about workforce participation? You know, we have this kind of strange dichotomy in Australia for some reason, but it needs this. It kind of needs a Gonski moment. I mean, you know, what he did with the school funding thing with his report was he and the panel put forward a clear reform path, and it needs that, but not just that. That's necessary but not sufficient. What it actually needs is a clear reform path, and it needs money. You have to buy reform in this space, because the only way you overcome those complexities within the sector and across the states and territories is actually to buy it. That's the honest truth. And how did they get Gonski? How did they get NDIS? By a major investment in additional funds. You know, Jay, you and I and Kate and others and Julie sat in those meetings. You know, you actually have to buy the reform, and you have to convince a government that it's worth investing. But the third point that I would make, of the three elements you need, is a clear reform path, money, and good timing. And perhaps now is good timing, because, you know, not to be too blunt about it, but, you know, never waste a crisis. I mean, what we're going to hear for the next 5 years is all about economic stimulus. Government's not going to spend less, they'll probably spend more. So it is economic stimulus, but it's also economic reform to do this. And, you know, we've heard all of the arguments around economic reform. So I think to be pragmatic about how you get governments to do the kinds of things we're talking about tonight, I think those are at least three of the major preconditions to get it done.
Thank you, Adrian. And I think that perfectly tees up the topic for Dr. John Hewson, who I think is also going to talk about the political climate, the policy challenges. Of course, Dr. Hewson has had several careers in academia, bureaucracy, business, politics and the media, and is currently an honorary professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU, and is of course a former leader of the Liberal Party. He worked for the Australian Treasury, Census and Statistics, That sounds rather dry, John. The INF, the Reserve Bank, the UN, the ADB, and of course advisors, senior public servants. So Dr. Hewson, can you pick up Adrian's challenge, and what is the economic argument for change here?
Well, thanks very much, Jay. I'm very pleased to be supporting this movement. Let me begin by acknowledging the Thurrbal people on whose land I'm sitting in Bowral, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging. And might I say, while it's very important that we do acknowledge country, if you might indulge me for a second, I think one of the big structural challenges for this country is to give proper recognition to the first Australians in the Constitution, a voice in the Parliament in some form, and certainly to do something genuine about Aboriginal disadvantage. And I think that's an overriding challenge for whoever's in government in this country. To pick up the point, I've spent most of my life, 50 years anyway, in public policy. I've had an overriding passion for good public policy, good evidence-based public policy, and whatever way I cut the issue of free universal early learning and childcare, I just find net benefits. Whether it's good economic policy, certainly good education policy. In fact, it provides a foundation for what somebody once thought was an education revolution. It's good family policy. It's good policy in so many ways. And when I look at the circumstances of today, with the opportunity that COVID provides us with, which is a complete policy reset and a priority reset as a government, as a community, I think it's an opportunity, as Adrian said, we shouldn't waste. I mean, it's a crisis that we can use to the benefit of the national interest. And early childhood education and child care is fundamental, I think, to that policy reset. It's been very encouraging to me about how much people have been prepared to adjust in response to the pandemic. This is something that it was predicted by many globally. It was not prepared for. Everyone was caught short, but we've moved individually, as households, as businesses, as governments, as institutions. We've changed the way we live, we changed the way we travel, the way we work, and a large parts of our lifestyle in a way that we never imagined would be possible, and much faster than anyone conceived would be possible. Some of those public servants you talked about, Jay, used to tell me about the strategy to digitalise the public service with about a 3 to 5 or 7 year horizon. It took 3 to 5 or 7 weeks, and it's happened. And in those circumstances, when people accept the significance of the challenge and broad-based community support for the significance of the challenge, and they understand the options that are there against which a government might set a policy, I think you're well on the way to making substantial reform. So I'm very encouraged by what you're trying to do. I have no doubt that the economics of this is overwhelmingly positive, but so are the social and other benefits of this. It's about time we took the opportunity of the COVID recovery strategy to reset those priorities and to reset those policies as to achieve that outcome. As to the politics of it, I mean, it's always going to be difficult. I agree with Julie, we should embrace the National Cabinet as the basis for this. You do need it to be bipartisan, which means you have to eat a bit of crow and include the opposition in that National Cabinet. I think the federal government could take total responsibility for funding it. It should be a joint or shared responsibility, if you like, for the policy development. And the service delivery involves a very difficult problem at the 3 levels of government. But I think that's the basis for an agreement. I don't think it's something that should be beyond the wit of any of them to actually do it. I think it's something we should be able to do and use the framework of the COVID recovery and the National Cabinet, a genuine National Cabinet, to do it. As for the politics, well, I just have to listen to my wife. She's been in my ear for several years, many years, saying the first government that stands up for free childcare and early education support will be in power forever. And I suspect that might be true. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hewson, for that powerful contribution. Now, we're now going to move to the live questions from the people that are here this evening. We have a number of distinguished guests on the line, and one of them has popped a question in the question box, so I might first go to her. Libby Lyons is the Director of the Australian Government's Workplace Gender Equality Agency, and I might invite Libby to ask her question.
Thanks, Jay, for allowing me to ask a question. I guess from my perspective, the issue around affordable, quality early childhood care and is that it takes away choice. If we don't have affordable early childhood care and education, we take away the choice of women and men in being able to engage in the workforce or re-engage in the workforce. I agree with many of the speakers here about the way we need to go about it, that it is probably a national cabinet thing, but I guess it comes down to the nitty-gritty. You know, how do we do this? How do we, and I've been trying to do it for years, but how do we let the voice of 50% of the population be heard by those that govern us? And currently, in terms of early childhood education and care, it's not being heard, and it is affecting 50% of the population. And if we are serious about economic stimulus in times of economic hardship, one way of being able to do that is by allowing women to have the choice to re-engage in the workforce or engage for the first time in many, many years. But they can't if there is no early childhood education and care that is affordable and quality. So how do we do it, practically speaking?
Thank you, Libby. And I think that's really a challenge for the campaign. I mean, from my perspective, being somebody that was in the position of having to make decisions, the most powerful thing is the voice of the people. And there is no politician in this country who is going to ignore a substantial social movement for change. So essentially the answer to the question is to join the campaign, and we will gather sufficient voices. The arguments have always been there. They've always been good quality arguments. What we need now are the voices of everyday Australians, educators, parents, people putting their names forward and are prepared to actually lift this from being, you know, wherever it sits on the list of priorities in the government to right up the top of their list. And you know, it's a long list. Governments have got lots of challenges. And Julie Bishop might have an insight into how we might do that.
Jay, I think it would be really important, and it's great that you and Kate are both on this call because you've been former Premier, former Chief Minister. I think that we need to get the states buy-in to the discussion because we're all talking about, oh, well, we'll put it on the National Cabinet. Well, that's only going to happen if the states all think this is a topic that needs debating. So I think that our campaign needs to embrace the state governments to say, we've got to come up with a solution. Now, it might be John Hewson came up with an idea, okay, the federal government funds it and the states do all the quality control or the, you know, the operation. It might be something completely different. It might be that the states take over control of it all and the federal government takes over disabilities. Or, you know, it might be a division of labour somewhere else in the health system or the education system. So I think we've got to get the state and territory governments on side to say, okay, can we come up with some proposals to take to national cabinet so that it's not all left on the federal government to come up with the responses, because I'm afraid that won't happen. It won't happen if it's just left to the federal government. Thank you, Julie. Thanks for that insight. I now know that during the period of COVID, there were certain experiences that a number of childcare operators experienced. And we have with us today Samantha Page, who is the head of Early Childhood Australia.
And I was wondering if she could make a contribution about what was experienced over this period of time.
Oh my goodness, thanks Jay. I mean, it's been quite a roller coaster for the early childhood sector. Early on, what we saw was parents keeping children at home, which was a very sensible decision when they were being told to keep older children home from school. But the current childcare subsidy system doesn't allow parents to do that without services continuing to charge fees, and that meant parents had to pay the gap. Which understandably wasn't very satisfactory to parents, so they were unenrolling children, so then services were losing all revenue altogether. And we had about 30% of the sector on the brink of collapse when we had the emergency relief package brought in, which a number of speakers have referred to as the free childcare period. And free childcare was fantastic for families and for children, and we saw a lot of very vulnerable children coming into services and picking up more hours, as Myra mentioned. But it was pretty tough for services to manage because it was actually 50% of their revenue pre-COVID. So it wasn't a place for everybody. It was free childcare for as many children as you could manage to have on site, and you needed to make some difficult decisions about who was essential workers and who wasn't, and who were vulnerable children and who weren't. So that was pretty tricky. But at least services did have the JobKeeper payment at that point in time. And I have to say it was a surprise to all of us when that was then withdrawn and the childcare subsidy was switched back on with a 25% transition payment. And if this sounds ridiculously complicated, my apologies, it is ridiculously complicated, and it meant that services had to implement within a matter of days a complete change in funding systems, not once but twice in the past 6 months. So I'm all for the campaign calling for universal and free or very affordable early childhood education and care for children. I think that's absolutely critical, but we also need to make sure that it pays professional wages to educators, teachers and service leaders, and that it's somewhat easier to explain than the various complicated systems that we've had to date.
Thanks, Sam. One thing I do want to mention is that Nicola mentioned earlier the work that Mindaru's been doing over a number of years in the early years. One of our flagship initiatives has been a parenting app called Bright Tomorrows, which is based on the neuroscience that has been translated by the wonderful Telethon Kids Institute into a series of 1,000 tips that are expressed in language which is easily accessible by parents. And so our conception of the system that we want is that it needs to have its heart parents. Obviously, parents are the first educators. They spend the overwhelming majority of time with their children, and we want a system that supports them, but we also want their own capabilities built as much as we can for them to be the best parents they can be. So the parenting app is critically important. The translation, in a sense, our campaign and the change that we want to see is to take the evidence and put it in the hands of parents. But a critical way of doing that is through the quality educators in the middle. They're the people that really translate the evidence and put it in the hands of parents. And so the parenting app is a critical way in which we do that. It's called Bright Tomorrows. It's in the App Store. We encourage you to download it. If you're an educator, an early educator, it's a wonderful resource. If you're a child health nurse, it's a wonderful resource to talk to parents about the way in which they can interact with their children. And it of course comes from the very best and trusted sources. I want to now throw to Gemma, and Gemma is on the line, and I wanted to ask her for any insights that she has about what other countries are doing. Surely other countries have grappled with this question, and there must be something to learn.
Well, actually, Joe, that was actually my question. I certainly don't have the answer. I guess Adrian was talking about how complex an issue this was, and we've all been talking to that point. What are other countries doing? What is considered best practice in this space? Do we need to reinvent the wheel? I know every country is different, but surely there's a starting point for us to launch from. And I really wanted to throw that question to the people on the call here. Right. Who can we look to kick this all off?
And maybe Fiona Stanley, if Fiona could perhaps initially respond to that, and I'm sure others might also be able to contribute.
Yeah, so if you look at some of the UNICEF report cards or the other rankings that you see, which really compare, I guess, mostly the OECD countries, then the countries that usually are at the top in terms of educational and other outcomes are countries like Finland and South Korea has come right up, and the most significant investment that South Korea made was for universal early childhood, and now they're reaping the benefits in terms of the international rankings. And I think that the Swedish system, in terms of all the things we've been talking about, is still probably the best comparison or best group to nation to aim for, because they have a wonderful system of early childhood education, which because children in Sweden don't go to school until they're 7, and yet they have one of the highest rates, as Marin O'Neill was talking about, the highest rates of female participation or mothers' participation in work in the OECD. And it comes down to a lot of things. It comes down to this universality of the childcare, of the early childhood education, the quality of it, and the fact that the mothers don't have the anxieties of that whole early childhood sector. And so they go to work with an equanimity and with a confidence that they're getting the best deal. So I think Sweden is obviously a country that we should look at. It's very interesting also that when you look at Sweden's, we've done a lot of international comparisons on child protection with 8 countries across the world, and it's very interesting that taking a child into care in Sweden is the last option. And so they have a huge investment in prevention of, so in addition to all of the children who get their universal early childhood, there's a very good assessment of children who are at risk and the secondary services that need to be around those children. And I've noticed some of the chats coming through, people like Emma Sydenham are asking about, the other social environments and housing and nutrition and all these things that children need. And so, so that in Sweden, for example, that early preventive strategies actually mean that you rarely take children away. And I think that investment in things that prevent domestic violence, that help parents who've got mental health problems and substance abuse and all the things which we know are very major risk factors, all of them increasing in Australia, that are really important risk factors for poor child outcomes, are dealt with very early in that pathway towards those end stage things where we spend so much more money. So I think look at Sweden, look at Finland. It's interesting that and in France, to be an early childhood educator, you have to have very high qualifications. So they're extremely sure that the children, when their brains are developing so rapidly, get the best educated teachers. In Finland, only 25% of people applying to get into primary school teaching and early childhood get jobs, because it's such a competitive area. Everybody in Finland wants to go into early child education, and it's not just because they have better salaries, it's only slightly better salaries. They have such fantastic working conditions and have a lot of ability to provide that high quality care. So I think it's a really good question in terms of what should we look, where we should be looking. And we know what the principles of providing really high quality child education are. It's just that we're going to have to modify them based on all the different circumstances, not just of individual parents, but communities in terms of where they live and what their capacities are. And that's very exciting, because you can have a principles of the early childhood sector, and then, and this may be local government, it could be Aboriginal communities, whatever, you will actually then, given the context in which you're delivering those services. And the other thing I want to say is that a lot of the comments that have come up in the chat about this really is a whole of government, we need a whole of government approach to this. We've got to try and get away from silos. And so however that's done, it really is a very exciting concept of how we do that. How do we actually say, well, we'll put the family unit in the middle and we'll put all the services around that child and that family for great success. Because it's very difficult if you've got an education department doing something, a child protection department, family services, housing, etc. let's make it as a one-stop shop as much as we can, because that siloed bureaucracy is very difficult.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And I know that there are lots of people that have come on the line today and asked a lot of questions about what the design of this system should look like. And there is no doubt that that critical work needs to go on. We have a clear idea about what the basic principles of a great early childhood development system look like. But the actual how we get from where we are today to what that system looks like will require a lot of very important work behind the scenes, and that work is going to be supported. The Minderoo Foundation is supporting that work. But the first phase of this campaign, which I think is critically important, is to first define the problems. We will not create the necessary platform to motivate the political class unless we can demonstrate that there is a problem that needs to be solved. Our politicians have a lot of problems on their plates, and it's very easy. There's no natural reason why early childhood should be shuffled to the top of the list. COVID has put it on the agenda in a way that I think Adrian Piccoli sort of observed really is meant that our time may have arisen. And so it's important that we maintain that momentum. Look, we are coming towards the end now, and I do want to just say a few words about where to from here, because I know that a lot of people are asking that question. We will get to your questions. We'll answer those over the course of the next few days. We also want you to stay involved in the campaign. We're going to create plenty of opportunities for you to do that. We're going to create a campaign journey for you, which will be promoted through the Thrive by 5 website, the thriveby5.org.au. One of the first things you can do, though, is to sign the open letter that's been penned by Nicola and Fiona, and has many of the people that you've heard from today who've contributed their signatures. So add your name to that so that we can then present that with many more names than the names that we have at the moment. And ask others to join. Ask others to join this campaign. Use your networks to make sure that we have the broadest possible coverage. Download the Bright Tomorrows app. It is a magnificent resource and will also provide extraordinary amounts of information that will allow you to discuss and debate this matter with other parents, with educators, with family and friends. Ladies and gentlemen, I am just so thrilled that you've chosen to actually add your voice to this campaign. I know that there are just so many different perspectives out there, but we're trying to bring this campaign together around a single and crisp ask, which is about universal, high-quality early learning. That is, in a sense, the arrowhead for the campaign around which we'll build the service system that we contemplate. And we think, from what we understand about community sentiment and the feedback we've already received, we think that this has a campaign of real chance of success. We think the time is ripe, and we firmly believe that this could be one of the next great social policy reforms for our nation. So thank you so much for adding your voice. I don't think there's no more important endeavour that I can imagine. And we're just so thrilled to see the array of wonderful speakers who have spoken tonight, and all of those people that have given your time and effort to be part of today's event. So thank you so much, and join the campaign, thriveby5.org.au. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona.